Hi, nice to be here. Especially because today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, so it's a great timing to be here and talk with you about web accessibility. Short introduction, who am I? I'm Tobias Roppold. I'm a UI UX designer, a front-end dev, and the founder of Gehirngerecht Digital. Frank translated it already. I would call it brain-friendly digital, but yeah, it's absolutely, it's difficult to translate it a bit in English. So, we have the mission to make the web more accessible, and that's what we're talking about today. And a short overview, we talk about the upcoming laws and about what accessibility actually means. Then we talk about challenges that come with the laws. We go on with the solutions for these challenges, and we end with the opportunities, so then you can take this obligation and make it for a business opportunity for your business. So this is the first time I give to speak in English, so be kind with me, and I try not to sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger all of the time. So let's go, accessibilities and the laws. What is web accessibility actually? Frank told it already, web accessibility ensures that everyone can use your website. That's basically accessibility in a nutshell. And these days, it's not possible for a lot of people actually to use websites like most of us are used to. In Germany, from the German population, we have 7.8 million who are severely disabled. These are 9.4% of the whole population, which is a huge amount of people actually. And we will have a very short look at some disabilities we are talking about. And for example, we have blind or visually impaired people. We have people with restrictions of movement, like for example, they are missing arms or they are paralyzed in some way. Then we have people who have cognitive disabilities, for example, Down syndrome or learning disabilities. And we have people who are deaf or are hard of hearing. This is really just a small overview. There are way, way more kind of different disabilities we care about, but it's a good point to start to thinking about it. But to be honest, at the moment, it's like almost nobody cares. Web accessibility, there are regulations and rules, especially for the public, but people ignoring them since 4 or 5 years. So it's a problem, even though now Europe was like, okay, we don't want this to be a problem anymore, so we make laws. They didn't really make laws, they made directives, and here's one. You don't have to get the name right, but you can translate, or there is a shorter, a better name, it's called European Accessibility Act. And this directive is on a European level, and in there you find accessibility requirements for digital products. It's not only about digital products, but we care about digital products most. So, and then Germany translated this directive into an actual law, and that's called Barrierefreiheitssta. I will not translate this because it will not help you to get an English name for it. If you search for it, you search for Barrierefreiheitsstärkungsgesetz, or you search for BFSG, and you will find all the information about it. It comes into effect on the 28th of June next year. And who is affected? Well, every electronic business transaction in the B2C space. So if you do only B2B, if your customers are only other companies who are not, if you make a website and the website is not used by end consumers, you don't have to comply to the requirements. So B2B is completely off the table. It's just B2C, but every business transaction. So if you have an online shop and you sell one pair of socks, you have to be compliant with the law. Doesn't matter how many products you sell. There are looser rules for service providers, but this is something we will not talk about today. So what does it mean for you if you have an online shop? Basically, like I said, there is the directive, and the German law is the Barrierefreiheitsstärkungsgesetz, and the requirements you have to comply to, you find in a European norm. It's called the EN 301 549. That's something you should remember because this will be super important to you. In this norm, you find 13 chapters. That's about everything from the whole product side, but we only care mostly. Not only, but we care mostly. Almost every one of you will care mostly about Chapter 9, because Chapter 9 is the complete web thingy or the online shop thingy, what you have to do to comply to the regulations. And the next step, but this is the last one, this norm points to the WCAG, also called WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You may have heard of them. These are the important rules you have to, there are requirements, how do you have to build your website to be compliant with the WCAG. And the WCAG, not to go into too much details, but it's based on 3 levels. It's at A, AA, and AAA, and you will be concerned with A and AA. And the WCAG 2.1 has 50 criteria of the standards A and AA you have to implement basically to make your website or your web shop accessible. On the left side for you. On the left side, you see a screenshot of one of those criteria. It's a lot of amount of a text, and it's super annoying to read about it, to be honest. So that's why we try to make it a bit more accessible to read the WCAG, actually. So afterwards, you can have a look on our website. We have every criteria. At least we give a good introduction to how to read it better, let's say it this way. Enough for the WCAG for the moment. We have a transition period for everyone till 2030. So if you have an online shop or a website that is online before the date of the 28th of June, you will fall into the transition period. So almost everyone here can be, yay, cool, but there is a problem. Let's say we sell hair care products online. And now we have the idea, well, it's going very well, and now we have the idea we want to introduce a new product line. And we sell now electronic products like hairdryer. If we do something like this, it can happen, it doesn't have to, but our lawyer told us that it's almost sure that it will happen in this case, that someone can come and say, this is a significant change on your website or in your online shop. And if you do a significant change, the whole product line you introduced now you have to be able to buy it in an accessible way. So you run into a problem that now you have to make the product page accessible, you have to make the cart accessible, and you have to make the checkout accessible, which obviously leads to a problem that now you must do your entire shop in an accessible way, because you will not build 2 shops, one for accessibility, an accessible checkout, and one for a normal checkout, because it doesn't make any sense. So you have, if you try to rely on the transition period and the time comes that you want to introduce a new product line, you will run into the problem that you have to make your whole website accessible from now on. So it will hinder your progress, actually. What are the consequences? So there is a German institution, it's called Marktüberwachungsbehörde. I really don't know what's the English name is for it, but it's an institution that looks about market and sees if everyone is compliant with the law, and if not, they can give you some fines up to 100,000 euro. There was actually a case of a Spanish airline who got sued 2 or 3 weeks ago with a fine of 90,000 euros, and they are not allowed to get public funding for the next 6 months. So that could be a huge problem for them. And if they don't change their website, they have to pay probably a fine again in the future. So now they have the fine, they are not allowed to get funding, and they have to spend their money to make their website accessible anyway. So it's problematic if you're not comply to the law. Now, the other way people can sue you, there are different ways, but the most important one for you could be unfair competition. If I make my shop accessible and you don't, I can say, well, I spent a lot of money, you didn't, I sue you because you're not compliant with the law, and this is unfair competition. This is something that happens a lot in America. America has these rules already since 2 or 3 years, or the laws. So that could be a thing that can happen to you easily here in Germany as well. Okay, enough from the law. All the law, like I told already, but the law will give you some challenges in the e-commerce space. First of all, obviously, there's a lack of knowledge. Maybe it's the first time today you hear about accessibility, and when the first time you try to learn about web accessibility, you face kind of like this problem. You look like super confused most of the time. Because web accessibility, it's not a rocket science. It's actually pretty easy, especially if you have a lot of idea about programming already, but it's a lot new stuff you need to know, and you have to change your whole cycle, how you make a product. For example, first of all, you have to have some kind of awareness. You have to know which kind of disabilities are there and how does people actually use websites. Like Frank said in beforehand, with screen readers, this is something you need to know what they are doing and how they use websites with this kind of technology. Then you have to change your design. You have to make your design accessible. All of this, we see a few examples later on. Then you have to change your code. Like I said, you have to make sure that your website you are able to use a screen reader on your website. For example, there are different assistive technologies, but a screen reader is something everyone has a kind of an idea of, or it's easy to understand what it is. And you have to change your content. You have to make some different there are some, how to put this, I show it later on in the examples what you have to change in the content to make it more accessible for everyone. And at least at the end, you have to test your website. You have to figure out if everything you did is now accessible for different assistive technologies. So your whole team needs to be involved in this process. Because if you have less knowledge, you will burn a lot of money. There's a guy, he's called Carl Grooves, super interesting guy from America. He does a lot of accessibility audits. He does this for, I don't know, 15 years, something like this. So he made a meta study about the accessibility audits they did, and he figured out per audit they find around 143 bugs. It takes a dev around 7 hours to solve a bug, and it costs around 250 euros per hour to pay the dev. I rounded this number a bit down. He had something with 370 something, but on a European level, he's calculating in their opportunity cost. So you have the cost for paying the dev for an hour, but you also have the cost for not having the dev working on a feature because he has to fix a bug. So he combines those two to come to this number. And if you sum it up, you end up with around 234,000 euros just for one audit to make all the fixes you find in this audit. So obviously, there are bigger websites he did the audits with, but it's a lot of money, and you can save actually a lot of this money if you spend it beforehand getting knowledge about accessibility. This leads us to the second problem. If you don't know what to do, you don't know how to plan all of this. We had a customer a year ago. He wanted to introduce new features like discount vouchers in his shop, or making an account area for the people, or there was a way to configure a product. And if you plan this feature from today till next year, you will end up with the problem that all of these features have to be accessible too in the future, obviously. So if you start today and you're not planning out the whole thing, you will end up with doubling your development costs a lot, because you have to redo everything you did this year. Maybe it will not take as long as a year again to fix it, to rebuild it, but there are some features, especially if they're super complicated, like the configure a product thing. If you do this not with accessibility in mind, you can face in the end, a super difficult way to make this accessible for everyone, because you need alternatives for things people can do with their mouse, because you have to ensure that your website is keyboard accessible and so on. But it can be extremely difficult if you not plan your feature with accessibility in mind from the get-go. So to not look like this in the end, just in summary, a lack of knowledge and a lack of planning leads to a lot of money is burned for you. That's when we come to the solutions. So how to become actually accessible? Accessibility is something like the new responsive design. It's something you have to start today, and you have to do this forever now. There's no end to being accessible. You can't say, now my website is made accessible, and that's it forever, because every new feature and every content you put in your website has to be accessible from now on. So your whole team needs to know this stuff, and there are more people, we can argue, that should know about accessibility, but this is a team who works on the digital product, like the product owner, the designer, the dev, the content creator, and someone who tests all of this. And now we go a little bit on what everyone can do to make a website more accessible or to speed up the process to get accessibility into it. And the product owner, obviously, he writes down requirements and the definition of done. And now you could expand your definition of done with, this is a minimum definition of done. You could say, after every task we did, we need to check our HTML, we run automated tests, we did manual testing, and we tested with assistive technologies. This is the way you normally test all the stuff. When you do it and how to do it, it's a bit more complex, but this is something you should put in your definition of done, at least, that you can ensure that web accessibility is kept in mind. There are, depending on your task, obviously, there can be super specific definitions of done you can write, so that's why this is the minimum. Then we come to the designer, and the designer really carries a big amount of responsibility. There's a company, it's called Dequi. It's one of the biggest accessibility plugin providers, and they figured out that around 67% of problems they are found with automated tests can be fixed by the designer already. So if the designer knows a lot of stuff, he can save the dev a lot of time and a lot of work with bug fixing. For example, color contrasts. You have to ensure as a designer that the color contrast is right. If you don't do this from the get-go, you have to change the colors afterwards, which not only can be a problem for your dev, it can also be a problem for your whole brand, depending on what you're doing, what you're designing. Then we have to ensure the logical order. This is something that has a lot to do with screen readers, how they read a website. It's just the designer can think about how he wants a component to be read by a screen reader, and if he can nail this down, a dev doesn't have to think about it themselves, and it really changes the way how you build a component with flex boxes and so on. If you know the logical order from the get-go, it's very, very easy for a dev to translate it into code. And you have to be aware of animations. You're not allowed to run animations endlessly anymore. At least you have to put in a pause button, but also you have different kinds of problems. If you have complex animations, people can set in their browser settings or in their software settings that they don't want to, or that they want to have reduced motion. And if you have reduced motion, your website has to respect this and shuts down the animations. So there's something, animations can be super tricky because it's hard to implement them, it's hard to maintain them, it has a lot of accessibility problems, so try to get rid of your animations or at least boil them down a little bit. And obviously, the designer can do a lot of documentation and communication with the devs to ensure that everything he was thinking about gets translated or gets communicated to the dev, that he saves a lot of money on or a lot of time on thinking about this themselves. So the devs have to ensure that everyone is able for the users to use, and they have to ensure that the HTML is correct, which is on a very few pages I saw in the last year that HTML is correct. It's such an easy thing to make it right, but a lot of devs, and myself also, I was a front-end dev, I was creating horrible HTML like 4 years ago. So you have to set attributes in your HTML for screen readers or other assistive technology to use or to read. You have to make sure that your whole website is keyboard accessible. So if you have a navigation and the navigation can be popped up with hovering over with the mouse, you have to make sure that now you can also have a other function to open the navigation with your keyboard. And in the end, there's something super important for an online shop. You need something like live regions. And live regions, like if you think about a screen reader can only read a website step by step. You have just one dimension. You can't see a website in 2 dimensions like we are doing it. So if something changes on a website, like say we have the price here, and below the price we have a way to change the amount of shoes we are buying. I skipped over the price with the screen reader. Now I change the amount of shoes I'm buying, and the price updates. Now, with a screen reader, I have no idea that the price updated. I need a way to get informed that the price changed. And one way to do is it's called live regions. If you make a live regions out of your price, it can or it will most of the time read out automatically if you do something that changed the content of this region. And in the end, not in the end, we have a tester, but the content creator creates accessible content. He writes alt text for pictures, for example. He puts subtitles into videos. He writes correct links, so you're not allowed to have links anymore. They're just called click here or buy now or whatsoever. Your link has really speak to me and tell me what I have or what I can expect if I click on this link. And in the end, we have the tester who tests all the stuff. The most people I know, they can't afford someone who only tests whole days, or someone else from the team has to do this stuff. So he knows the assistive technologies, he knows the screen readers, he knows the magnifiers and voice control, and that are the most important ones you have to check your website, or you should check your website with. There are some others, but they are not as important at the moment. He has to ensure that everything works everywhere, so screen readers and browsers can work differently with each other, so you should at least test 2 browsers or 2 screen readers. And you can do manual testing, which is in the end just going over all of your websites, having the criteria on the right side, looking on your website for all the criteria and writing down if you find an error or not. This is something you have to do because automated tests, at least today, maybe AI will or can help in the future, but today you can find only around 40, at max 50% of the problems on a website with automated tests, so you have to do a lot of manual testing yourself. How to train your team? You can go to the IAAP, it's the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and you can get training there or a certification. But to get a certification, you at least have to have 5 years of experience in the field. So you need some knowledge beforehand before you go there and say, hey, I want a certification from you. So you can hire an expert, someone who knows all the stuff. You can just bring him in and let him teach your team or make something himself. Or you can book our workshops. We do a lot of workshops about the whole design, dev, and content creation thing. That's about it with the solutions. Now, I have a minute left, great. So we talk a bit about the opportunities, but I go into a discussion with Frank about opportunities. So here, how can you turn the obligation into a business opportunity? If you start now or if you start today, you could have a lot of upside with attracting new talent, show actually that you care, boost your image through doing this, establishing a new USP, improve your SEO, and get more customers. The cost side is you have to make design improvements, you have to fix your bugs, and you have to train your people. If you do this, 2025, you run into the problem that all the upsides you get now will not be there anymore because nobody is believing you that you do this for a good cause. You're just doing it because you have to comply to the law. So you're missing out, you're potentially missing out a very big opportunity to make your brand bigger or to get an USP and get known as someone who does accessibility and get a bit ahead of your competition. And if, like I said before, if you're doing all of this next year, you have a problem that you have to re-implement all of your new features, you have to pay probably your fines, and you have, again, the design improvements and so on. So the downsides could be way more than the upsides. And I will not go into detail now, because I will talk about it with Frank, and we go into detail then. And perfect timing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias Ruppert. Really amazing topic. How many of you knew that this will be mandatory from 2025? A third, about. So we brought some new stuff to 2/3 of the audience. Let's go into Q&A. Who has a question? We need to wait for the microphone. It's coming up there because we have a video stream. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks for the introduction. I have two small questions. One is, if you're annotating like a form label, that's usually like a programming thing because you always have the IDs in English. So I assume that those need to be translated as well in the future?
It depends. So if you have a label in, I don't know if I can go back, but so every form field has to have a label that it's combined with the input field under it. So it has to be programmatically, you have to find out with assistive technology, if you go on the label, it has to say it's a label for this input field. And you don't do this with the ID normally, you set an extra attribute for doing this. But I can, so we can talk about it later on and I can show you. Yeah.
And the second question would be, there is cases where there's a feature in your shop that is just not meant to be used by visually impaired people. So if you have like a visual product designer that's just, it doesn't make sense for a visually impaired person to use it. Is that covered by the law somehow? So I flagged a feature like you can't use it, so I can still provide it, or do I have to cancel it out because it can't be used by visually impaired people?
So that's a super important question. Thank you for asking. Accessibility doesn't mean that you have to make it worse for anyone. The idea is that you make it better for everyone. And that means if you have a feature which is obviously only there for people who can't see, that's totally fine, but you have to provide an alternative. So I have to get at least somehow the information I get from what I can do and see there. You know what I mean?
So if I write down, you could probably do this if you would be able to see.
No. So you, for example, you have I don't know what can we make as an example, but if you have a future, you can turn around your thing in 3D and look at it from all sides. So then you could just try to describe what you're doing there. Your intention with your feature, you have an intention. You want that someone who looks at it and uses it gets something from it, some insight, some idea, some anything, and you try to get this idea or this insight also across to someone who can't do this. You know what I mean? Even if it's just text. If you say, hey, this is a feature, it shows something in 3D, and you don't write there, you can't use it, but if you want to make kind of a smart or a nice interaction, you could. But you just can write it down and make an alternative for what you're seeing there. So there must be some way to have an alternative. For example, like the easier example is you have a navigation pops up if you go over with the mouse. Not everyone can use this, so you have to have an alternative, which is that people can go over it and open it with their keyboard. Or, for example, you have a picture. Obviously, a picture can't be seen by people who can't see, so you have a text alternative, actually. So you don't have, your picture can have an alt attribute in all text, but you don't have to. You can just write the text next to it what you see in the picture, which is not a big problem with just pictures, but it's a big problem with complex images. If you have infographics or something like this, you have to somehow get across what is on the infographic to someone who is not seeing it. And there you have to find alternatives. But it doesn't mean you're not allowed to have the features anymore. You just have to think about how to make alternatives which are helpful for people. And this is something, it's not, I would highly recommend, especially if you have things like this, to just talk to blind people and ask them what they want, what they wish to have instead of this. And they will give you probably a really good answer to this.
Great, sounds complicated. Any more questions? So then the final one from my side, you mentioned the testing, and you said there are distinct testing tools for accessibility. Can you mention one so that people could go out there, test their own website, how it is right now, and how bad or how good it is already?
So there are testing tools. You can do automatic tests, for example, with Wave is a website. You can test your own website. Or X dev tools are, this from the company is called Dequi, I mentioned before. You can use their dev tools for free and just scan your website. But like I said, you will find just problems that are, well, I mean, most of the problems the automatic testing tools find are still the most known problems, like having problems with color contrast, which is super easy to fix, but still, like, 78% of websites or something like this have problems with color contrast. And you can use tools like this to figure the easy stuff out and see how your website performs. Don't use the Chrome accessibility tool thingy. It's useless. It just shows you nothing from importance. So go on. You can do, XDev tools would be what I recommend. But there are other ways. We have a lot of things on our website, how you can test your website. I have a whole article about testing where I write about automated tests, how you can integrate it in your acceptance test, and how you can do manual testing and everything. You find a really, I hope, a good introduction on how to test yourself or with your team.
Thanks a lot, Tobias Röppel. You will be around today, so people can talk to you, and they have a big applause for you. Thank you.
Thank you.